The government had a surprising enemy on Question Time this week. The right-wing commentator Peter Hitchens, who, perhaps surprisingly, spoke in favour of the rail unions.
The first thing we have to recognise in all these pay disputes is to ask the question, who's doing the pushing? Whose conditions have been changed by whom? And everybody in this country who's at work and paid at the moment is being pushed by inflation and a rising cost of living. The wages which they had 2 years ago are not the wages they have now. They're worth considerably less. And under those circumstances, people who have the power to try and get back some of what they've lost from inflation can be expected to do so. And the railwaymen are among us. I wish the minister would stop referring to train drivers and what they're paid. Obviously, they are part of the dispute, but most of the people who are taking part in it are not train drivers, and they aren't paid anything like that. And it's silly of him to keep saying that, because it muddies the waters. I don't know how best you can compromise. My own view of British governments and the railways has been for many years that it's the government which causes far more disruption to my twice daily travel on the trains than any union has ever done. The failure to maintain the ludicrous experiment of privatisation, which largely wrecked the railways, the constant track circuit failures, signal failures, and other things, which and currently I can't even get to work properly because a bridge has collapsed on my way to work. This is not a well-run, seriously invested service, and it's not taken seriously by the government, which runs a ministry for roads with railways tacked on. But I am not convinced that all justice in this is on the side of the government and the employers. And one of the reasons I'm not convinced of it is because people like the minister keep saying it's all about train drivers when it so patently isn't. People are facing, as I understand it, the actual compulsory loss of jobs in
No, they're not. No, that's not
nobody
true.
at all.
That's not true.
That's gone completely.
There's no requirement for compulsory.
There's no compulsory redundancy.
No, but one of the things that's been offered by the employers is no compulsory redundancies.
And that's
when the
agreed
union
now,
has said that there are going to be lots of job loss, that's simply not true.
So that was Peter Hitchens rather effectively taking the government to task. This might surprise, it surprised me, I have to say, Aaron, and I'm sure it will surprise some of our viewers. Peter Hitchens, of course, is known as, not just a sort of centre-right columnist, but a very right-wing columnist, someone who's, talks about bringing the death penalty back or anti-abortion. And, he's also economically not left-wing. Why has he come out in favour of strikes? You've interviewed him before. You know the guy. Were you surprised when you saw this clip?
No, I wasn't surprised, Michael. He has identified, to me, he said he's a social democrat on economic issues. Now, you might think that's ridiculous. Tony Blair, social democrat. Yeah, Tony Blair doesn't think that we should have rail and public ownership. So, look, on cultural social issues, Peter Hitchens over here, right? Not far right, but extreme right. And then on economic issues, he's kind of what should be the centre-left, like Nordic centre-left, right? Not the British centre-left. And actually, that's a really popular politics. It's not something we really talk about very often, but it's a really popular politics. Basically sort of red UKIP is a very popular politics. 70, 60% of people want to see less migration, although people are more welcome to immigration over time, it turns out. Since Brexit, people have been more receptive to the idea of immigration. But people generally want less immigration. But also on a case-by-case basis, even a majority of Tory voters favour bringing things like rail or Royal Mail back into public ownership. So actually what Peter Hitchens is articulating there is a very popular sort of convergence of right-wing orthodoxies on things like immigration, less so on abortion, just completely at odds with the rest of the country, less so the death penalty, although it's important to say that's really a 50-50 split. And actually, there's polling out there that says, I think for pedophilia, a majority of people would support the death penalty. Again, it's something we don't really talk about on the left. I don't personally support the death penalty. Of course, if you kill somebody who's innocent, you can't bring them back. It's a pretty good argument against it. And clearly, with the death penalty in places like the United States, hasn't really done much to curb crime. So, he has some quite esoteric, eccentric ideas with regards to the death penalty or abortion. Although he's not particularly fanatical about it. He's not campaigning for them, it should be said. And then on the economy, he does have some sort of classically centre-left opinions. Peter Hitchens, with that set of views, he probably would have been quite comfortable in the Labour Party in like the early 1950s. And he would say that's just him being sensible. But in the context of the British commentariat, despite the fact that, let's say, a good chunk of the public agree with that or sympathise with that set of views from a range of places, it's very rare to see a member of the commentariat saying that. So it can be quite surprising. And he is a bit of an iconoclast. He is a bit of a contrarian. But on this, he's not being a contrarian. He's been very, very consistent over a number of years. He supports public ownership of rail. He's a big advocate of rail. He loves trains. He loves trains. He thinks that what we did to trains in this country in the 1960s were an appalling mistake. And he supports public ownership, and he thinks that trade unions are a big part of giving working people a fair slice of the pie. It probably tells us something, that there aren't that many people in the media with his views coming from the right who actually are articulating things which a conservative probably would have said in the 50s as well. I said he could have been comfortable in Labour in the 1950s. Frankly, his views on some things are quite reminiscent of somebody like Harold Macmillan, with regards to respecting workers' rights, or not necessarily workers' rights, but respecting the agency of the labour movement. And public ownership. Of course, the Tories didn't try and fiddle with public ownership of the big utilities too much right through the 50s, right through the 60s when they were in charge. Anyway, of course, Wilson came in after 64. So, yes, he can seem eccentric, but actually there are historical parallels. And when it comes to public opinion, he's quite representative of quite a big chunk of the country.